As technology and culture has evolved, humanity has continued to invent new forms of expression, like newspaper comics, and almost every time a new art form arrives, it's immediately labeled as cheap and dangerous leisure, to be avoided and regulated. In the West, at least. It wasn't too long ago that comic books were being heavily restricted for extreme violence and some abstract notion of distastefulness. At the time, the Comics Code Authority decided what artists could sell and what was thrown away. Now, it wasn't too bad. These rules were, of course, extremely reasonable. Horror terror in your title? That's just Satan behavior. Sympathy for the criminal? That's politically problematic. Zombies and vampires are just too scary. Now, this ain't new. In the 30s, cartoons were quickly neutered. No kissing, no udders, and no femboys. In the 20s, the Hays Code was unleashed on the American film industry. Drug trafficking, white people marrying black people, saying the Lord's name in vain, nudity, no. And although these codes don't have power anymore, their impact today has run deep. While Disney started off making some pretty wild stuff, it quickly got toned down. Like, when they were making The Little Mermaid, Japan was making Akira. When Pixar released Toy Story, Anon was directing Evangelion. Now, I love those old American animations, but today I still consistently find grittier, harder stuff in anime, which I think forms a big part of its appeal. Things are changing, but the standard for adult animation in the West is still Rick and Morty. And it's the same for games. Although the sentiment is shrinking, the general notion is still that games are nothing more than cheap entertainment for glue-sniffing morons and young people who don't have anything better to do. But while their constant fetishizing of violence and power is quite overbloated, games really are quite more addictive than most entertainment. Like, have you ever kept playing a game without knowing why? You're bored and you have, actually work to do, but you just keep playing anyways? And you can't help but come back like a itch you just can't scratch no matter what? This kind of behavior is labeled by the medical community as a compulsion, an irresistible urge to repeat an action, even though one rationally knows their actions are stupid and dumb. Games, through their interactivity, have the power to ensnare us. But how? Ludemes, mechanics, elements of play, whatever, they're the rules that make up games. During game development, your goal is to create and refine Ludemes to fit your vision. Some ideas are useful in almost every game, like health or controllable protagonists. Some mechanics are genre-defining, like platforming or first-person shooting. They form the unique, soft, spongy, chocolatey core of gameplay. Some are useful in certain contexts, or in conjunction, like high scores. Developers have to evaluate the right time to use them. Then, there are compulsive mechanics. Now, these don't cause compulsion per se, but they take advantage of weird little quirks in our brain. In some contexts, they're just, fun, normal mechanics. But in some cases, they're manipulated to induce compulsive behavior. So, I'm going to show you how to do that. Random chance. Purely repetitive action is one of the most boring activities people can do. But if you attach a small random chance for something nice every time, we'll feel a compulsion to repeat it. The reward doesn't even have to be helpful. With a small random reward, what was once repetitive can become compelling. For some games, random chance just adds a nice spark to already fun gameplay. For example, a lot of roguelikes use the thrill of rare synergies to keep the player going through their really punishing challenges. I can't count how many times I died in Slay the Spire, then thought, well, next time I'm gonna get Corruption Dark Branch, and I just, hit new game and keep playing for 5 hours. The problem arrives when random chance is used cheaply to hook the player. Think the constant loot boxes in mobile games, annoying loot tables, or those frankly ridiculous shiny hunting marathons. Like, come on guys, that's just, you're crazy. Second, competition. Like random chance, competition creates a bizarre external incentive to repeat action. The brain is kind of hardwired for competition and just really wants to be better than other people. It's kind of messed up. I love competitive games, but you can probably recognize when you're playing to win and not lose, and when you're playing for the gameplay's actual earnest fun. Thirdly, big numbers. In most games, numbers are used to measure power and resources. By simply increasing those numbers, especially exponentially, developers can trick people into thinking they're partaking in efficient, optimal action, and that makes their monkey brains pretty happy. Cookie Clicker and Vampire Survivors are pretty good examples of using this numbers thrill to ameliorate gameplay, while other games use cheap leveling systems or power creep to create the illusion of power without actually increasing gameplay depth through, novel mechanics. Fourth, sunk cost. The sunk cost fallacy is a phenomenon where people feel invested to continue something to prevent the awful feeling of loss. Like, we really hate Lost. The first way is to make actions take a long damn time, so the player wants to go through with it. This is why we wait for those awful loot crates. The other way is to attach a bunch of digital properties to your game. This creates a sense of ownership to the account and thus a psychological relationship to the game itself. Lastly, routine. Like every great citizen, I drink coffee in the morning, eat lunch at 12, and doom scroll all the way to bed. Humans are just great at maintaining routines, even if they really don't want to. Yep, we can use habit to induce compulsion. So if your game can tie itself into your audience's routine, you win, baby! Here's some routes to get there. Periodic and predictable events, weekly updates, daily challenges, Ludemes that reward players if they stop and come back later, like those damn energy bars or those stupid mobile loot crates that make you wait 8 hours! These mechanics establish themselves in routines by keeping players continually coming back. Now, I don't play mobile games anymore, thank God, but Jesus, Spelunky dailies have ruined me. Alright, so, what's the point? What's the point of all this? Well, I have 3 different conclusions depending on who you are. First, for you game devs, I believe as game devs we have an ethical incentive to make games that improve lives, not make people regret how they spent their time. These mechanics can be pretty great, but please make sure that players actually care and are engaged rather than just compelled to play your game. Especially you mobile game developers, I'm looking at you! When your game is exhausted, your players should be able to easily put it down and walk away satisfied. These compulsive mechanics, use in moderation, like sugar. There's not really a right amount, you kind of have to just evaluate the situation. Next, for the players. Hopefully you only just found this interesting, but if you do have an addiction or guilty pleasure video game, hopefully these Ludemes make it easier for you to recognize when you're being engaged or just actively compelled to play the game. I think it helps. Next for you policymakers, if you're watching. In the EU, Parliament has sought to combat compulsive games in several ways. While most countries are just like, I'll get around to it, a lot of countries have labeled loot boxes as gambling. You know, which is a step. Although it seems these regulations are just eternally mothballed everywhere, so, you know. In China, they've imposed spending and time limits on games for minors. The National Press and Public Administration also censor for compulsive Ludemes and change them accordingly. Like pop-ups whenever they perform irrational behavior. By the way, this is why Chinese game versions are often so different, or why Western companies are forced to cooperate with Chinese companies if they want to enter the Chinese market, which is pretty gargantuan. Now TBH, I don't think these solutions will fix too much. It's kind of a mouthful, but here we go. A, banning loot boxes has 2 main problems. They're not always a source of compulsion. Low drop rates aren't always addicting, and regulating them would heavily restrict the design space. If the regulations were less generalized, then developers can just semantics loot boxes into a different form. There's a lot of ways to appeal to randomness. Loot boxes are just the obvious ones. Imposing restrictions on minors has a load of problems too. China requires a pretty intrusive Face ID system to operate this. Although, you know, it's not even effective. Apparently Chinese kids can just use VPNs or their parents' account to bypass it. Don't tell the government. Also, everyone is susceptible to compulsion, not just stupid glue-sniffing minors. The vast majority of gambling addicts are older people, and I'm pretty sure you guys know an oldie or two who's, you know, addicted to Candy Crush. And of course, I can't continue without talking about the codes. As we've already discussed, these often hinder the industry and are manipulated to fit some government agenda. Like, let's be real here, the NPPA is censoring a lot more than just unfriendly mechanics. In summary, regulations are very invasive in art, and they don't really solve the core problems. I'm most confident in raising awareness, but just telling people their activity is irrational and stupid is pretty useless. They already know. Instead, we need to promote a global kind of cultural understanding of compulsive Ludemes and how they affect us. And not just for players, developers should know this stuff too. As both of those, it's helped me both make better games and play better games. Recognizing compulsive Ludemes is like wiping that diabetic frosting off and seeing what value the cake really has. So, yeah.